Have you ever looked your greatest disappointment in the eye and realized you've become their salvation? The moment my father's face registered who was sitting behind the desk he'd come to beg for a job from, that split second when recognition, shame, and disbelief washed over him, I felt 15 years of pain crystallize into something unexpected. Not victory, not revenge, something more powerful: indifference. The frightened 18-year-old girl he'd thrown away like yesterday's trash was gone. In her place sat a woman who held his future in hands he no longer recognized. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Every ending has a beginning, and mine started on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in June, when my father decided I was no longer worth keeping. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was Olivia Taylor, firstborn daughter of Richard and Diane Taylor, raised in a modest colonial-style house in Durham, North Carolina. From the outside, we appeared to be the quintessential American family: father who ran his own construction company, mother who taught second grade at the local elementary school, and me, the seemingly well-adjusted teenager with decent grades and a spot on the debate team. Our lawn was always mowed, our Christmas lights always tasteful, our public appearances at church and school functions always accompanied by appropriate smiles. I learned early on that appearances mattered above all else in the Taylor household. "Stand up straight, Olivia," my mother would whisper harshly before we entered any social gathering. "Remember who you are." Who I was, as it turned out, was a carefully maintained extension of my parents' image. I existed as evidence of their success, a living testament to their parenting abilities. When I performed well, winning the regional debate championship in 10th grade, for instance, I was momentarily visible to them. My father actually looked me in the eye that evening, placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, and said, "You didn't embarrass us. Good." From him, this was effusive praise. The rest of the time, I moved through our house like a ghost, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of my father's temper. He wasn't physically abusive. Richard Taylor would never do anything that might leave evidence or generate gossip. His tool of choice was silence, wielded with surgical precision. He could go weeks without speaking directly to me if I disappointed him in some way. My mother, eternally anxious to maintain her husband's approval, followed his lead in all things, including how to treat their only daughter. Despite these emotional undercurrents, I wasn't unhappy, exactly. You can't miss what you've never experienced, and I'd never known unconditional love or genuine emotional support. Instead, I focused on pragmatic goals: maintaining high enough grades to qualify for college scholarships, working part-time at the local bookstore to save for expenses, and planning my eventual escape to a university preferably several states away. I'd researched options extensively, applied for every scholarship I could find, and by the spring of my senior year, I'd been accepted to Emerson College in Boston with a partial scholarship. Not enough to cover everything, but with my savings and a possible student loan, I could make it work. Or so I thought. The evening of my high school graduation remains etched in my memory with perfect clarity. I remember the scratchy polyester of the blue cap and gown, the weight of the honor cords around my neck, the way the evening humidity made my carefully straightened hair begin to curl at the edges. After the ceremony, several of my classmates were heading to a party at the lake, but I declined. My parents had mentioned having something important to discuss with me, and in our household, such summons were not optional. We drove home in silence, my diploma case clutched in my sweaty hands. My mother had prepared a small dinner. Nothing celebratory, just the usual Wednesday night pot roast served a few days early. I remember thinking it was odd that she'd made pot roast on a Saturday, breaking her usual menu schedule, but I said nothing as we took our places at the dining room table. "Olivia," my father began after precisely 3 bites of his meal, "your mother and I have been discussing what happens next." I nodded, setting down my fork. I've been meaning to talk to you about that. I know the Emerson Scholarship only covers tuition, but I've been saving from my job. And if I could just get a small loan for the housing deposit— You won't be going to Emerson, my father interrupted, his voice flat. That's not what we've decided. The sudden coldness in my stomach had nothing to do with the iced tea I'd been drinking. What do you mean? I've already accepted their offer. My mother glanced nervously at my father, then fixed her gaze on her plate. We've been planning this for some time, Olivia. Your father has an opportunity to expand his business to Charleston. We're moving at the end of the month. Charleston? I repeated, my mind racing. But I can still go to Emerson, right? I'll just come home to Charleston for breaks instead of here. My father set down his knife and fork with deliberate precision. No, Olivia. You won't be coming with us to Charleston, and we won't be funding this Boston fantasy of yours. You're 18 now, a legal adult. It's time you stood on your own 2 feet. I stared at him, waiting for more explanation, but he simply resumed eating. My mother remained focused on cutting her pot roast into increasingly smaller pieces. I don't understand, I finally said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Where am I supposed to live? What about college? That's for you to figure out, my father replied without looking up. We've carried you for 18 years, provided food, shelter, clothing. That responsibility has been fulfilled. We've already given notice on the house, my mother added quietly. The new owners take possession on the 30th. You'll need to have your things out by then. The surreal quality of the conversation made me wonder briefly if this was some elaborate joke or test. You're kicking me out? Just like that? With 2 weeks' notice? Don't be dramatic, Olivia, my father sighed. This is called adulthood. Most people your age would be grateful for the opportunity to prove themselves without parental interference. Most people my age have parents who care about their future, I countered, immediately regretting the outburst when I saw the familiar hardening of my father's expression. And there's the attitude that confirms we're making the right decision, he said coldly. Your mother and I have worked too hard to have our retirement plans derailed by your sense of entitlement. Boston, of all places, completely impractical. I sat in stunned silence as they continued eating, discussing the Charleston weather and housing market, as if they hadn't just demolished my entire world. Later that night, alone in my room, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had there been signs I'd missed? Was this punishment for some transgression I'd failed to recognize? Or had they always been counting down the days until they could discard me without social repercussions? Sleep eluded me as I mentally cataloged my resources. I had approximately $200 saved from my bookstore job, nowhere near enough for college, without parental support or a co-signer for loans. My partial scholarship would cover about 60% of Emerson's tuition, but nothing toward room and board. The bookstore position was seasonal, ending next week when the summer staff took over. Most of my belongings could fit in my ancient Honda Civic, which at least was paid for, though it made alarming noises when driven above 55 mph. By morning, when I heard my parents leaving for Sunday church service without bothering to knock. On my door, I had no plan beyond a desperate sense that I needed allies. I reached for my phone and dialed the one person who had occasionally shown me what genuine care looked like. Ms. Abigail Chen had been my debate coach for 3 years. Unlike my parents, she'd attended every competition, celebrated every victory, and helped me analyze every defeat as a growth opportunity rather than a failure. More importantly, she'd noticed things. When I was fighting a cold but refusing to miss practice, when I was wearing the same clothes too many days in a row because our washing machine was broken and my mother hadn't gotten around to doing laundry. Small kindnesses, a discreetly offered cough drop, a casual mention that the debate club's lost and found had too many clean hoodies that needed homes, had shown me what consideration for others looked like. The phone rang 4 times before her warm voice answered. Olivia? This is a surprise. Everything okay, hun? I opened my mouth to give a standard fine thanks response, but what emerged instead was a choked sob. Once the dam broke, words poured out in a jumbled flood. Graduation, Emerson, Charleston, 18 years, responsibility fulfilled. Through it all, Ms. Chen made small sounds of acknowledgement, never interrupting, allowing the full story to emerge. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I finally fell silent, the pause stretched long enough that I feared the connection had been lost. Ms. Chen? I'm here, she replied, her voice containing a controlled anger I'd never heard before. I'm just taking a moment so I don't say something unprofessional about your parents. Olivia, listen to me carefully. This is not normal. What they're doing is not what loving parents do, even when they disagree with their child's choices. Her validation unleashed fresh tears. Someone else could see it. This wasn't just me being dramatic or entitled. Here's what's going to happen, Ms. Chen continued, her voice shifting into the decisive tone I recognized from debate preparations. You're coming to stay with me and my sister for now. We have a spare room that's yours for as long as you need it. Today, you'll pack your essential belongings. Tomorrow, while your parents are at work, my sister and I will help you move everything else you want to keep. I can't impose on you like that, I protested weakly. You're not imposing, I'm offering, she corrected firmly. And Olivia? Don't. Tell your parents where you're going. Given what you've described, I don't trust them not to make this harder than it already is. The decisiveness in her voice provided a lifeline to cling to. Okay, I agreed, wiping my eyes. I'll start packing. Now? Good. One more thing. Don't give up on Emerson just yet. I have a few ideas we can discuss once you're settled. After hanging up, I sat on my bed for several long minutes, trying to absorb the seismic shift in my reality. Yesterday, I had been a high school graduate with plans for college and a family who, while emotionally distant, I believed provided basic security. Today, I was effectively homeless, my future uncertain, about to move in with my debate coach. The absurdity might have made me laugh if it wasn't so terrifying. I began sorting through my possessions with a ruthless practicality born of necessity. Clothing, personal documents, and a few sentimental items went into suitcases. Books, academic, awards, and debate trophies were carefully wrapped and boxed. By the time my parents returned from church, followed by their standing Sunday lunch with the Hendersons, I had transformed my childhood bedroom into an organized staging area for departure. My father paused in my doorway, surveying the boxes, with narrowed eyes. At least you're being sensible about this, he remarked, as if he'd expected hysterics. Make sure you're out by the 30th. The new owners have a teenage daughter who's quite excited about this room. No questions about where I was going? No concern for my welfare? Not even curiosity about my plans? In that moment, something crystallized within me. A realization that Richard Taylor had never seen me as a daughter to love, but as an obligation to fulfill. Now that the obligation had a socially acceptable end date, he was simply closing that account in his ledger. I'll be gone by Tuesday, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. You won't have to worry about me. He nodded once and turned away, but not before I caught an expression flicker across his face. Was it relief? The thought should have hurt. But instead, I felt an odd sense of clarity. If he could discard me so easily, perhaps I'd never had anything of value to lose in the first place. The next morning, after my parents left for work, Ms. Chen arrived with her sister Lily and a borrowed pickup truck. The efficiency with which they helped me pack the remainder of my belongings worth keeping was both impressive and heartbreaking. By noon, we had loaded the last box, and I stood in my empty bedroom, feeling strangely detached from the space where I'd spent 18 years. Do you want to leave them a note? Lily asked gently. I considered this as I ran my hand along the bare mattress. What could I possibly say? Thanks for the biological necessities. Sorry I wasn't worth keeping. Nothing seemed adequate or necessary. No, I finally replied. They've made their position clear. So have I. Ms. Chen squeezed my shoulder. Then, let's go home, Olivia. Home. The word felt foreign, a concept I wasn't sure I understood anymore. Nevertheless, I followed them down the stairs, through the living room with its formal furniture rarely used, and out the front door. I didn't look back as we drove away. The Chen sisters lived in a modest craftsman-style bungalow on the other side of Durham, in a neighborhood of towering oak trees and eclectic gardens. Unlike the sterile perfection of my parents' house, their home hummed with warmth and life. Bookshelves overflowing with well-worn volumes, walls adorned with art, collected during travels, mismatched furniture arranged for conversation rather than appearance. The blue room is yours, Lily explained, leading me down a short hallway. Bathrooms across the hall, shared with me. Abby has the master with its own bath. Kitchen's always open. We're not formal about meals around here. Eat when you're hungry, but we try to have dinner together most nights. The blue room was small but charming, with a twin bed nestled under a window overlooking the backyard garden. A simple desk, dresser, and small bookshelf completed the furnishings. Someone, Lily, I suspected, had placed a small vase of fresh flowers on the windowsill. It's not much, Ms. Chen said from the doorway, watching my reaction. It's perfect, I replied honestly, setting down my backpack. I don't know how to thank you both. Lily waved away my gratitude. You can thank us by focusing on your future, not your past. Abby tells me you're quite the debater. I'm an attorney, you know. Good career for people who like to argue. Ms. Chen, who had gently insisted I call her Abigail outside of school, rolled her eyes at her sister. Give her a chance to breathe, Lil. College first, then career decisions. Speaking of which, I ventured cautiously, about Emerson. I don't see how it's possible now. Without my parents as co-signers for loans, and with housing costs. First things first, Abigail interrupted. Let's get you settled, then tomorrow we'll start making calls. I know people at several universities, including one of the admissions. Counselors at Duke, you've got options, Olivia. Different ones than you planned, perhaps, but options nonetheless. That night, I lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of a household different from any I'd known. Lily's late-night pacing as she prepared for a case, the gentle creak of floorboards, a distant wind chime in the garden. For the first time since my parents' announcement, I allowed myself to fully feel the abandonment. Not just the practical implications, but the emotional wound of being discarded by the people who should have loved me most. I cried then, silently into the pillow, grieving not for the loss of the parents I had, but for the parents I'd never had. When the tears finally subsided, something unexpected remained, a fragile sense of possibility. Perhaps, freed from the constant effort to earn approval that would never come, I could discover who Olivia Taylor actually was, and what she truly wanted. The next morning over breakfast, Abigail announced her plan of attack for my college situation. You've been accepted to Emerson with a partial scholarship. That's valuable leverage. We're going to contact them, explain the change in your circumstances, and inquire about additional financial aid. Meanwhile, we'll also reach out to local options as backups. I've already called my friend at the legal aid clinic, Lily added, pouring more coffee. She says there are provisions for students who've been abandoned by their parents. You qualify as financially independent now, which could actually increase your eligibility for certain grants. I stared at them, overwhelmed by their immediate mobilization on my behalf. Why are you doing all this for me? The sisters exchanged a glance laden with meaning I couldn't decipher. Because someone did it for us, Lily finally said. Our parents died when Abby was 17 and I was 15. Our English teacher took us in, helped us navigate the system, made sure we still got to college. We promised her we'd pay it forward when we could. And because you deserve it, Abigail added simply. You're bright, hardworking, and none of this is your fault. Why wouldn't we help? The matter-of-fact way they offered life-changing support, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to reorganize their lives to accommodate a teenager they barely knew, shifted something fundamental in my understanding of how people could be with each other. That summer became a crash course in adulting under the guidance of the Chen sisters. While Lily helped me navigate the bureaucracy of financial independence, changing my mailing address, opening a separate bank account, applying for independent student status, Abigail worked her network of academic connections with relentless determination. By August, the impossible had become reality. Emerson College had increased my scholarship based on my changed circumstances, and a special hardship grant would cover most of my housing costs. The balance would be manageable with work study and a small subsidized loan in my name alone. I would still be going to Boston, still pursuing my dream of studying communications and public relations. The evening after we received the final financial aid package, the three of us sat on the Chen's back porch, celebrating with ice cream and a sense of triumph that felt entirely new to me. Fireflies blinked in the gathering darkness as cicadas provided their summer symphony. I have something for you, Abigail said, disappearing into the house and returning with a small gift bag. A going-away present. Inside was a leather-bound journal with my initials embossed on the cover. For recording the next chapter, she explained. Your story is just beginning, Olivia. What if I fail? I asked, voicing the fear that had lurked beneath all our planning. What if it's too hard and I have to come back and... Then you'll come back to this house, regroup, and try something else, Lily interrupted firmly. That's how life works. You try, you fail, you adjust, you try again. The only true failure is letting fear stop you from trying at all. I ran my fingers over the smooth leather of the journal, imagining the blank pages within waiting to be filled. I don't know who I am without trying to be what they wanted, I admitted quietly. That's the adventure, Abigail replied with a gentle smile. Finding out. 2 weeks later, I stood in Boston's Logan Airport, clutching the handle of my suitcase, with one hand and the strap of my overloaded backpack with the other. The Chen sisters had insisted on flying with me to help me settle into my dormitory, an extravagance I'd protested until Lily had fixed me with her courtroom stare and declared, non-negotiable, counselor. As we navigated the unfamiliar subway system toward Emerson's campus, I felt equal parts terror and exhilaration. The city pulsed with an energy utterly unlike Durham's leisurely pace. Students from dozens of universities filled the streets, everyone seemingly in motion, purposeful, and independent. My dormitory room was tiny, institutional, and perfect, a blank canvas shared with a roommate from Seattle named Zoe, who arrived with blue hair, an extensive vinyl record collection, and a refreshing directness. Parents? She asked as we arranged our respective sides of the room. Complicated, I replied. Then, seeing her raised eyebrow, added, not in the picture. She nodded, accepting this without further questions. Mine are divorced, dad's cool, mom's intense. These are my people, she said, gesturing to the Chens who were assembling a desk lamp. Yes, I agreed, the word feeling significant. They are. The goodbye, when it came, was harder than I'd anticipated. Lily hugged me fiercely, slipping an envelope into my hand that I later discovered contained emergency cash and a prepaid return ticket for Thanksgiving. Abigail held me at arm's length, her eyes suspiciously bright. Remember, she said, your story belongs to you now. Write it however you want. As I watched them walk away, I felt a curious mixture of loss and freedom. For the first time in my life, I answered to no one but myself. The possibilities were terrifying and intoxicating. That night, as Zoe's gentle snoring filled our room, I opened my new journal and wrote my first entry. Today, I became someone new. I don't know who she is yet, but I think I might like her. College was both harder and more wonderful than I'd imagined. The academic demands were intense, pushing me to develop critical thinking skills beyond anything required in high school. But more transformative was the social environment, a place where curiosity was valued above conformity, where passion trumped perfection, where my classmates debated ideas for the sheer joy of intellectual exchange rather than to impress authority figures. I landed a work-study position at the campus communications office, where I assisted with press releases and social media for university events. My supervisor, Professor Diaz, quickly noticed my knack for crafting compelling narratives and began assigning me to cover major campus events. By the end of my freshman year, several of my pieces had been published in the alumni magazine, and Professor Diaz had invited me to join a select group of students working on a special public relations campaign for the college's upcoming centennial. "You have a gift for seeing the story beneath the surface," she told me during my performance review. "You find the emotional hook that makes people care about the facts." Her words struck me as profound, not just professionally, but personally. For years, I'd lived on the surface of my own life, presenting the facade expected by my parents while burying my actual feelings beneath layers of compliance. Now I was learning to excavate authentic stories, both in my work and in myself. Sophomore year brought new challenges and opportunities. When a coveted internship opened at Hammond Strategic Communications, Boston's premier PR firm, Professor Diaz encouraged me to apply despite the position typically going to seniors. "They're looking for fresh perspectives," she insisted. "Your portfolio speaks for itself." The interview process was grueling. 3 rounds of increasingly difficult assessments culminating in a crisis management simulation where we had to develop a reputation-saving strategy for a fictional company facing public backlash. Drawing on my debate experience, I approached the challenge methodically, identifying stakeholders, crafting tailored messaging, and developing a transparent accountability plan that acknowledged the company's failings while demonstrating commitment to improvement. When the acceptance email arrived 2 days later, Zoe insisted on celebrating with a proper Boston experience, a Red Sox game followed by cannoli in the North End. As we watched the game from the nosebleed section, surrounded by passionate fans, I felt a surge of belonging I'd never experienced in Durham. "To Olivia Taylor," Zoe toasted with her paper cup of beer, "future PR goddess and master of making people believe the impossible." I laughed, but the words resonated. In a sense, wasn't that what I'd been doing my whole life? Crafting a narrative that made my parents' emotional neglect seem normal, acceptable. Perhaps it was time to direct that skill toward more worthy ends. The Hammond internship proved transformative. 3 days a week, I worked alongside seasoned professionals, absorbing everything from crisis management to brand development. My supervisor, Marcus Keene, was demanding but fair, pushing me to refine every pitch and presentation until they shone. "In this business, you're only as good as your worst day," he reminded us constantly. "Excellence isn't an achievement, it's a practice." Unlike my father's impossible standards, Marcus's expectations came with mentorship and specific guidance. When I fell short, he didn't withdraw in disapproval but engaged more deeply, analyzing where my thinking had gone astray and helping me correct course. Under his guidance, I developed confidence in my professional judgment that extended gradually into my personal life as well. By my junior year, the Hammond internship had evolved into a part-time paid position. With their compensation, plus my work-study hours, I finally achieved financial independence, no longer needing to rely on loans or emergency funds from the ITC Chens, though I remained deeply grateful for their ongoing support. Our Sunday evening calls had become a cherished ritual, with Lily offering legal advice about my employment contracts and Abigail sharing updates from Durham's debate team, which she continued to coach. It was during one of these calls, in the spring of my junior year, that Abigail mentioned casually, I ran into your mother at Whole Foods yesterday. My hand tightened around the phone. Oh? She pretended not to see me at first, but I cornered her in the produce section, asked how Charleston was treating them. And? I prompted, surprised by my own curiosity. She looked uncomfortable, said they'd moved back to Durham. About a year ago. Apparently the Charleston expansion didn't work out. Abigail's voice remained carefully neutral. Your father's business ran into some difficulties. They've downsized considerably. Something complicated twisted in my chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but a grim sense of karma at work. I'd spent 3 years rebuilding my life while they'd been dismantling theirs. Did she ask about me? The question escaped before I could stop it. The brief silence told me everything before Abigail even spoke. No, honey, she didn't. I nodded, forgetting Abigail couldn't see me through the phone. It's fine. I was just curious. Olivia, Abigail's voice softened. Their failure to see your worth says everything about them and nothing about you. You know that, right? I'm learning to, I replied honestly. After hanging up, I sat on my dormitory windowsill, watching the bustling street below. 3 years earlier, news of my parents' struggles would have devastated me, either from misplaced guilt or desperate hope that hardship might have softened their hearts toward me. Now I felt only a distant sadness for what might have been, coupled with growing certainty about who I was becoming without their influence. The following week, Marcus called me into his office at Hammond. I arrived with notebook in hand, assuming he wanted to discuss the healthcare client whose campaign I'd been supporting. Instead, he gestured for me to sit, his expression unusually serious. Olivia, how much do you know about Vertex development? I blinked, mentally searching my knowledge base. Southeast Regional Commercial Developer, formerly family-owned, but went public about 5 years ago. They specialize in mixed-use urban renewal projects. Decent reputation in the industry, though they've faced some community pushback over gentrification concerns. Marcus nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. Hammond just landed their account. They're expanding into the Northeast market, starting with Boston. It's a major acquisition for us, and we're assembling a dedicated team. He paused, studying me carefully. I'd like you to be part of it. Me? I couldn't keep the surprise from my voice. I'm still just a junior. You have exceptional instincts for community relations, which is exactly what Vertex needs as they enter a new market. The team needs someone who can help them navigate local sensitivities without compromising their business objectives. He leaned forward slightly. It would mean more hours and greater responsibility, but also higher compensation and a potential pathway to a full-time position after graduation. The offer was both thrilling and intimidating. Would I still be able to balance my coursework? We'll work around your class schedule, Marcus assured me. Education comes first, but Olivia, opportunities like this don't come along often, especially for someone at your stage. This is the kind of experience that launches careers. I thought of Lily's words from 3 years ago. The only true failure is letting fear stop you from trying at all. I'm in, I said, meeting his gaze directly. Thank you for the opportunity. Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. Don't thank me yet. You've got a lot of work ahead. He handed me a thick folder. Background materials on Vertex and their Boston plans. First team meeting is Thursday at 2 hours. Come prepared. I spent every spare moment before Thursday immersing myself in Vertex's history, structure, and development philosophy. Their portfolio impressed me. Thoughtfully designed projects that balanced profitability with genuine community enhancement. Their founder, Thomas Vertex, had articulated a vision of development with dignity, creating spaces that served diverse economic needs rather than simply pushing lower-income residents out of improving neighborhoods. However, As I dug deeper, I noticed a shift in recent projects. Since going public, their developments had become increasingly luxury-oriented, with less emphasis on affordable housing components or local business integration. It wasn't dramatic enough to signal a complete abandonment of their founding principles, but the trend concerned me. Thursday's meeting introduced me to the full Vertex team, including their Northeast expansion director, a polished executive named Catherine Winters. She led a detailed presentation on their Boston plans, highlighting a major development in a historically working-class neighborhood now experiencing the first waves of gentrification. During the question period, I gathered my courage and raised my hand. Ms. Winters, I noticed the affordable housing allocation in this project is significantly lower than in Vertex's earlier developments. Given Boston's housing crisis and the neighborhood's current demographics, have you considered how this might affect community reception? A momentary silence fell over the conference room. Catherine studied me with narrowed eyes, clearly unused to being challenged by an intern. Finally, she offered a thin smile. An interesting observation, Ms. Taylor. Olivia Taylor. Ms. Taylor. While we appreciate your concern, Vertex's responsibility is primarily to our shareholders. The Boston market demands luxury units, and we're responding accordingly. Our PR strategy will focus on job creation and economic revitalization. I nodded, careful to keep my expression neutral despite my disappointment. After the meeting, I expected a reprimand from Marcus for speaking out of turn. Instead, he fell in to step beside me as we returned to the Hammond offices. "Good question in there," he commented. Winters didn't appreciate it, but it needed to be asked. "I wasn't trying to create tension," I explained. "But their current approach seems at odds with their founding vision, and that disconnect could become a PR issue when community groups inevitably push back." Marcus considered this. "Draft a brief outlining your concerns and potential strategies for addressing them. Nothing formal, just your thoughts. I'll make sure the right people see it." That evening, I worked late into the night, carefully balancing respect for Vertex's business objectives with honest assessment of the reputational risks their current approach entailed. I proposed concrete strategies for community engagement, transparency measures, and modest adjustments to their development plan that could generate substantial goodwill without significantly impacting profitability. 3 days later, Marcus forwarded me an email from Vertex's CEO, James Harrington. Impressed by the Taylor analysis, refreshing to see someone thinking beyond standard PR platitudes, would like to discuss further. What followed was a whirlwind. My brief became the foundation for a revised community relations strategy that earned praise from both Vertex leadership and eventually from neighborhood advocacy groups when implemented. By the time I began my senior year, I was working 20 hours weekly at Hammond while maintaining my academic standing, exhausted but exhilarated by the real-world impact of my work. "You've made yourself indispensable," Marcus told me during my performance review. "Hammond will be making you a formal offer before graduation. Director track position, exceptional compensation package for someone your age." The validation was sweet, but even sweeter was the knowledge that I'd earned this opportunity through genuine merit, not family connections or desperate attempts to please authority figures. For perhaps the first time in my life, I felt truly seen for my capabilities, rather than measured against impossible expectations. At graduation, Abigail and Lily sat in the audience, cheering embarrassingly loudly when my name was called. They'd flown in 2 days earlier, helping me pack up my dormitory and prepare for my transition to a small apartment I'd found in Cambridge, closer to Hammond's offices. That evening, as we celebrated with dinner at a restaurant far nicer than I could typically afford, Lily raised her glass. "To Olivia Taylor," she toasted, "who proved that family is about who loves you, not who shares your DNA." I blinked back tears, overwhelmed by gratitude for these women who had stepped into the void my parents had left. "I wouldn't be here without you both." I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You already have, Abigail said softly, by becoming exactly who you were meant to be. Later that night, after the Chens had returned to their hotel, I stood on the small balcony of my new apartment, watching the Cambridge skyline glitter against the darkness. 4 years ago, I'd been discarded by the people who should have cherished me most. Today, I had a degree, a promising career, chosen family who loved me unreservedly, and a future limited only by my own ambition and effort. I thought briefly of my parents, wondering if they ever regretted their decision, if they ever wondered what became of the daughter they'd so easily abandoned. The question no longer carried the ache it once had. Their absence from my life had become merely a fact, not a defining wound. Opening my journal, the same one Abigail had given me 4 years earlier, now filled with entries documenting my transformation, I wrote, "Today marks not just an academic achievement, but a personal one. I am no longer defined by who left me, but by who stayed, and more importantly, by who I've chosen to become." The next 5 years passed in a blur of professional advancement and personal growth. Hammond's offer exceeded even Marcus's promises, placing me on an accelerated leadership track that had me managing my own client portfolio within 2 years. I developed a reputation for ethical innovation, helping companies align profit motives with social responsibility in ways that benefited all stakeholders. My approach attracted clients who valued authenticity over spin, earning Hammond both industry recognition and growing revenue. By 27, I'd been promoted to senior director, the youngest in the firm's history. My colleagues jokingly referred to me as the fixer, the person they called when a client faced complex reputational challenges requiring more than standard PR tactics. Outside of work, I'd built a life rich with chosen connections. Zoe and I remained close, meeting monthly for brunch despite her hectic schedule as a music producer. I'd developed friendships with colleagues who shared my values, joined a community garden in my neighborhood, and even cautiously ventured into dating, though no relationship had yet progressed to serious commitment. The Chens remained my emotional anchor, our Sunday calls continuing despite busy schedules. Abigail had been named principal of her school, while Lily had recently been appointed to a judgeship, achievements we'd celebrated during my last visit to Durham 6 months earlier. It was during one of these Sunday calls that Lily mentioned casually, "I had an interesting case come across my desk this week. Taylor Construction is being sued by several subcontractors for non-payment. Wasn't that your father's company?" My hand tightened instinctively around my phone. "Yes. Did you recuse yourself?" "Immediately," Lily assured me, "but not before seeing that they're in serious financial trouble. Multiple liens, pending bankruptcy proceedings. Thought you should know, in case it somehow circles back to you." "It won't," I said with certainty. "I haven't had any contact with them in 9 years. I doubt they even know where I am now." Yet after hanging up, I found myself opening my laptop and typing Taylor Construction Durham into the search bar. The results painted a grim picture, a company in freefall, multiple lawsuits, and a website that hadn't been updated in 3 years. A local Business Journal article detailed how Richard Taylor had bet big on expensive commercial developments just before the market downturn, leaving the once respected family business on the brink of insolvency. I closed the browser, surprised by my lack of emotional response. There was no satisfaction in their struggles, no vindication. If anything, I felt a distant pity, recognizing the devastating impact of poor decisions magnified by stubborn pride, traits I knew my father possessed in abundance. 2 weeks later, Marcus knocked on my office door, an unusual occurrence since he typically communicated via email or scheduled meetings. His expression was unreadable as he closed the door behind him. "Olivia, I've just had a rather unusual call from James Harrington at Vertex. They've acquired a small construction company in North Carolina as part of their Southeast consolidation strategy. Apparently, the company is in dire straits financially, but has potential regional contacts. Vertex finds valuable. He paused, studying me carefully. The company is Taylor Construction. Any relation? The floor seemed to shift beneath me. My father's company, I confirmed, my voice steady despite the sudden pounding of my heart. Though I haven't had any connection to my family in almost a decade. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. Harrington remembers your work on their Boston expansion. He specifically requested that you lead the communication strategy for this acquisition and restructuring. Another pause. I told him I'd need to discuss it with you first, given the personal connection. I took a deep breath, processing the implications. What exactly would this involve? You'd need to travel to Durham for at least a few weeks. Vertex is keeping some of the existing staff during transition, including the current management. His meaning was clear. I would likely encounter my father. If you're not comfortable with this assignment, I'll handle it personally. Harrington will understand. A decade ago, my father had cast me out of his life without a backward glance. Now, through cosmic coincidence or karmic justice, I had the power to influence the fate of his failing company, and by extension, his future. The irony was almost too perfect. I'll do it, I said, surprising even myself with the immediacy of my decision. The personal history won't be an issue. Marcus studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. I trust your judgment. But Olivia, if at any point this becomes too complicated emotionally, there's no shame in stepping back. Sometimes the professional and personal don't mix well. I appreciate the concern, but I can handle this. I managed a small smile. After all, crafting difficult narratives is what I do best. As Marcus left, I sat motionless, trying to identify exactly what I was feeling. Not revenge. I'd long since moved past wanting to hurt my parents. Not anxiety. I was secure in my identity and accomplishments. Perhaps it was simply curiosity, a desire to close a chapter that had remained ambiguously unfinished for almost a decade. That evening, I called the Chens, needing their perspective before committing fully to this path. Are you sure about this? Abigail asked after I'd explained the situation. You've built such a good life, Olivia. You don't owe them anything, not even closure. I know, I acknowledged, but I think I might owe it to myself, to face them not as the desperate 18-year-old they discarded, but as the woman I've become, on my terms, from a position of strength. Lily's voice was thoughtful when she spoke. Just be clear about your objectives. If it's closure you want, define what that looks like for you. And remember, you can set boundaries at any point. After ending the call, I opened my journal, attempting to articulate my jumbled thoughts. What did I want from this encounter? Not reconciliation. Too much damage had been done for that. Not revenge. Success was already my best revenge. Perhaps what I sought was something simpler. The chance to stand before my father as an equal, possibly even a superior in the professional realm he valued above all else. To demonstrate through my presence rather than words that his assessment of my worth had been catastrophically wrong. 2 days later, I boarded a flight to Raleigh-Durham International Airport, a comprehensive transition plan for Taylor Construction in my briefcase, and a complex mix of determination and apprehension in my heart. As the plane descended through clouds into the familiar landscape of my childhood, I straightened my shoulders and adjusted my professional mask, the polished, confident persona that had carried me through countless high-stakes negotiations. This time, however, the stakes were entirely personal, and despite 9 years of careful emotional insulation, I couldn't deny the flutter of something suspiciously like anticipation at the prospect of finally, definitively showing Richard Taylor exactly who his daughter had become without him. The rental car I'd picked up at the airport felt incongruously luxurious against the faded industrial park where Taylor Construction maintained its offices. What had once been my father's pride, a custom-built headquarters with his name emblazoned across the facade in bold lettering, now showed clear signs of neglect. The landscaping had grown wild. The parking lot sprouted weeds through cracked asphalt, and the sign hung slightly askew, as if mirroring the company's precarious financial position. I sat in the car for several minutes, gathering my composure and reviewing my strategy. Vertex had arranged for me to meet with Richard Taylor at 10 o'clock, introducing me simply as the Hammond representative handling transition communications. They hadn't mentioned my name specifically, a detail I hadn't corrected when reviewing the meeting agenda. The element of surprise wasn't strictly necessary, but I couldn't deny a certain dramatic satisfaction in the prospect. My phone buzzed, with a text from Abigail. "Remember who you are now, not who they said you were." The simple reminder centered me, and I stepped out of the car, smoothing my charcoal pencil skirt and adjusting the tailored blazer that projected professional authority. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman in her 50s I didn't recognize, barely glanced up as I entered. "Can I help you?" "Olivia Taylor from Hammond Strategic Communications," I replied, noting with detached interest that my voice remained steady despite the surreal quality of announcing myself in my father's office. "I have a 10 o'clock with Mr. Taylor and the Vertex team." She nodded listlessly, picking up the phone. "Mr. Taylor, your 10 o'clock is here. Hammond Communications." A pause. "Yes, sir." She hung up and gestured toward a hallway. "Conference room at the end. They're expecting you." I thanked her and walked deliberately down the corridor, noting the dusty framed awards and faded project photos that had once showcased the company's former glory. When I reached the conference room, I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and opened the door. 4 people sat around a table that could have accommodated 20, a visual testament to the company's diminished state. I recognized Catherine Winters from Vertex, seated beside a younger man I assumed was her assistant. Across from them sat my father, thinner and grayer than I remembered but still projecting the rigid posture and stern expression that had dominated my childhood. Beside him was a nervous-looking man clutching a legal pad, likely the company's accountant or legal counsel. Catherine rose to greet me. "Ms. Taylor, thank you for joining us. We were just getting started." She gestured toward my father. "This is Richard Taylor, founder and CEO of Taylor Construction, and his financial officer, Martin Webb." I set my briefcase on the table, my gaze steady as I turned to face the man who had cast me out of his life without a backward glance 9 years earlier. "Mr. Taylor," I said, extending my hand professionally. "Olivia Taylor, Senior Director at Hammond. I'll be overseeing the communication strategy for this transition." The moment of recognition was exactly as I'd imagined and entirely different. His hand froze halfway to mine, his eyes widening as disbelief, confusion, and something unidentifiable flashed across his face. The conference room fell silent, the tension suddenly palpable. "Olivia?" His voice was smaller than I remembered, the authoritative tone replaced by genuine shock. I maintained my professional smile, completing the handshake he'd left hanging. "Yes, it's been some time." Turning to Catherine, I smoothly continued, "Shall we begin? I've reviewed the preliminary materials and prepared an initial communication framework for your consideration." Catherine glanced between us, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't understand, but professional enough not to inquire. "Of course, please proceed." For the next 45 minutes, I led a detailed presentation on stakeholder identification, messaging priorities, and timeline management for the acquisition announcement. Throughout, I maintained meticulous professionalism, directing questions primarily to Catherine while acknowledging Martin's financial concerns. My father remained largely silent, his eyes rarely leaving my face, his expressions cycling between disbelief and something that, in another man, might have resembled shame. When I concluded, Catherine nodded approvingly. "Excellent framework, Ms. Taylor. This addresses our primary concerns while maintaining appropriate sensitivity to the Taylor construction legacy. Legacy is important, I agreed, allowing myself to meet my father's gaze directly for the first time since my initial greeting. Though sometimes what we build isn't what we intended. A muscle twitched in his jaw, a telltale sign of tension I remembered from childhood confrontations. "Ms. Winters," he said abruptly, "could we have a moment with Ms. Taylor to discuss some company-specific messaging considerations?" Catherine hesitated, glancing at me questioningly. I nodded slightly. "That would be fine. Perhaps you and your colleague could review the draft press statement I've included in your packets. Martin might have valuable input on the financial language." Once they'd left, closing the door behind them, silence descended. I remained standing, gathering my presentation materials with deliberate calm, refusing to initiate the conversation. He clearly wanted, but struggled to begin. "Olivia," he finally said, his voice rougher than I remembered. "This is unexpected." "Yes," I agreed simply, continuing to organize my papers. "How long have you been with Hammond?" 7 years. I was recruited directly from Emerson College. His eyebrows rose slightly. "You completed your degree?" "Magna cum laude," I replied, the achievement statement neither boastful nor apologetic. "Double major in communications and business administration." He nodded slowly, visibly processing this information. "And now you're Senior Director, Crisis and Transition Communications, the youngest in the firm's history." I closed my portfolio, finally meeting his gaze directly. "Is there something specific about the communication strategy you wanted to discuss, Mr. Taylor? The Vertex team is waiting." The formality clearly discomforted him, eroding the familiar authority he'd wielded throughout my childhood. For perhaps the first time in our shared history, Richard Taylor appeared uncertain. "You know they're dismantling the company," he said finally. "Everything I built over 30 years. They're keeping the name for regional recognition, but restructuring everything else." I nodded. "That's generally how acquisitions of distressed companies work. Vertex is actually being quite generous in their approach. Many of your employees will retain positions, and they're honoring completed contracts. Do you enjoy this?" he asked suddenly, bitterness edging his tone. "Seeing my company, my life's work, carved up while you direct the narrative?" The accusation might once have wounded me, triggering the familiar guilt response he'd so effectively conditioned. Now, I simply regarded him with professional detachment. "This isn't personal, Mr. Taylor. I'm doing my job, just as you did yours." I paused, considering my next words carefully. Though I admit there's a certain symmetry to the situation. His jaw tightened. "Meaning?" 9 years ago, you informed me that your obligation to me was fulfilled. Your financial officer suggested the small conference room would be most appropriate." He nodded, accepting the conversation's shift to business matters. "Martin will show you where everything is." He hesitated at the doorway. "Will I see you tomorrow?" The question contained a vulnerability I'd never witnessed in him before, an uncertainty that transformed him momentarily from the towering figure of my childhood into simply an aging man facing the collapse of everything he'd built. "Yes," I confirmed, my tone professional rather than personal. "I'll be on site daily until the transition announcement next Friday." He nodded once more and departed, leaving me alone in the conference room, a space that symbolized both his company's decline and my professional ascension. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, though it brought less satisfaction than I might once have imagined. That evening in my hotel room, I called Abigail, needing the grounding of her perspective after the surreal experience of the day. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. "Professionally, exactly as planned. The initial framework was well received, and I've already completed preliminary stakeholder interviews." "And personally?" I sighed. kicking off my heels and stretching, out on the hotel bed. Complicated. He seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating than I remembered. That's often how it goes when we face our childhood dragons as adults, Abigail observed. We realize they were just people all along, flawed, limited people who sometimes made terrible choices. He suggested I meet with my mother while I'm here, I added, still processing the unexpected development. A pause on the line. How do you feel about that? I don't know, I admitted. Part of me is curious. Another part wonders what purpose it would serve beyond satisfying their conscience. What about your closure? Abigail asked gently. Might there be value for you in hearing what she has to say? I considered this. Throughout my healing journey, I'd focused primarily on my father's role in my abandonment. He had always been the decision-maker in our household, with my mother functioning more as his echo than an independent voice. Had she disagreed with his decision? Had she regretted it afterward? The questions had occasionally surfaced in therapy sessions over the years, though I'd never expected to have the opportunity to ask them directly. Maybe, I acknowledged, but on my terms, not theirs, and not at their house. I'm not interested in playing happy family reunion. That sounds like a healthy boundary, Abigail approved. Just remember, you don't owe them anything. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not even this conversation if you decide against it. After hanging up, I opened my laptop to review the day's interview notes, but found myself distracted by swirling thoughts about my mother. Unlike my father's authoritarian presence, her impact on my development had been more insidious. A quiet reinforcement of the message that I was somehow lacking, that my worth was measured by achievement rather than inherent value. The memory that surfaced was from 7th grade, a district science fair where my project on alternative energy had received honorable mention rather than the first place I'd expected. Instead of comfort, my mother had offered a critical assessment. Perhaps, if you'd focused more on presentation rather than just content. The Hendersons' daughter had color-coordinated graphs. Her disappointment had been palpable, her affection conditional on achievement. How many such moments had shaped my understanding of love? How deeply had I internalized the message that I was only valuable when performing to expectations? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown local number. Olivia, it's your mother. Richard gave me your number. Could we meet for coffee tomorrow? Just the two of us. I stared at the message, emotions colliding like weather fronts. Anger, curiosity, residual hurt, and unexpected nervousness. The immediate impulse to decline warred with the persistent question that had lingered for 9 years. Why? Why had she allowed it? Why had she never reached out? After several minutes of contemplation, I replied, Carolyn's coffee shop downtown. At 10:30 a.m. tomorrow. I have meetings starting at 9. The response came almost immediately. Thank you, I'll be there. Setting the phone aside, I returned to my work with renewed focus, channeling the emotional turbulence into meticulous preparation for the following day's meetings. Whatever revelations tomorrow's coffee might bring, I would face them as I now faced all challenges, from a position of hard-won strength, not vulnerability. Carolyn's hadn't existed during my youth in Durham. It was part of the downtown revitalization that had transformed the once sleepy city center into a vibrant urban district. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table near the window. That offered visibility of the entrance while maintaining a semblance of privacy. I'd chosen my outfit with deliberate care, a sleek navy sheath dress with a structured blazer that projected professional confidence while remaining approachable. My hair was pulled back in a smooth chignon, makeup precise but understated. The armor wasn't for appearances but for internal fortification. Each element of professional polish reminded me of how far I'd come from the frightened 18-year-old who'd packed her belongings in garbage bags. At precisely 7:30, the door opened and my mother entered. She scanned the shop anxiously, her appearance both familiar and changed, her hair now fully gray and cut in a practical bob rather than the carefully maintained blonde she'd sported throughout my childhood. She'd lost weight, her frame slightly stooped as if bearing an invisible burden. When her gaze found mine, a complex mixture of emotions flickered across her face: recognition, relief, and something that might have been shame. I didn't rise to greet her, merely nodding to indicate my location. She navigated through the morning crowd, hesitating briefly before taking the seat across from me. "Olivia," she said softly, her voice exactly as I remembered. "Thank you for meeting me." I nodded, gesturing to the counter. "Would you like coffee? I was waiting until you arrived." "Yes, thank you. Just black, 1 sugar." She fumbled in her purse. "I'll get it," I interrupted, standing. "I need a refill anyway." At the counter, I ordered her coffee and a second cappuccino for myself, using the brief interlude to steady my unexpectedly rapid heartbeat. The sight of her had triggered more emotion than I'd anticipated. Not the anger I'd expected, but a complicated sadness for all that had been lost. Returning to the table, I set her coffee before her, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for it. We sat in awkward silence for a moment, the gap of 9 years stretching between us like an unbridgeable chasm. "You look wonderful," she finally said. "So professional. Richard said you work for a big firm in Boston." "Hammond Strategic Communications," I confirmed. "I'm a senior director specializing in crisis management and corporate transitions." She nodded, a flicker of something like pride crossing her face. "That sounds impressive. Important work." "It can be," I acknowledged, neither elaborating nor reciprocating her tentative warmth. "What did you want to discuss, Mom?" The direct question seemed to startle her. She'd always been more comfortable with social niceties and surface conversations, avoiding difficult topics whenever possible. She faltered, then steadied herself. "I wanted to see you, to know that you're all right." "I am," I confirmed, "though not because of anything you or Dad did to ensure it." She flinched slightly, her gaze dropping to her coffee cup. Your father thought you'd be fine, that you'd go to the community college, get an apartment with friends maybe." Her voice grew smaller. "I didn't know you had nowhere to go." I studied her, searching for signs of deception or self-justification. Instead, I saw only a weary sadness, the gradual erosion of whatever narrative she'd constructed to justify their abandonment. "Dad knew exactly what he was doing," I said carefully. "He made it very clear that I was an obligation that had been fulfilled. 18 years, no more, no less." She nodded slightly, not denying my characterization. "He can be rigid. Once he makes a decision, he doesn't reconsider easily." "And you?" I pressed, the question that had haunted me for years finally finding voice. "Did you agree? Did you think abandoning your only child was the right course of action?" Her hands tightened around her cup, knuckles whitening. "I should have fought harder," she whispered, the admission seeming to deflate her further. "I told myself you'd be fine, that you were smart and capable, that maybe some independence would be good for you." A tear slipped down her cheek. "But the truth is, I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of your father, of being alone, of what would happen if I defied him." She looked up, her eyes wet. "It's not an excuse, just the truth. I chose my security over my daughter, and I've lived with that knowledge every day since." The raw admission hung between us, neither accusation nor defense, but simply acknowledgement of a devastating reality. For years, I'd constructed various scenarios in my mind, that they'd convinced themselves I'd be fine, that they truly believed tough love was appropriate, that they'd somehow not understood the implications of their actions. Never had I considered that my mother had fully recognized the cruelty of their decision, but lacked the courage to oppose it. "What would you have done?" I asked, genuinely curious. If you'd fought harder, as you put it, what alternative would you have proposed? She seemed startled by the question, perhaps having expected recrimination rather than inquiry. I would have. Insisted we help with college, at least. Maintained contact, offered support. She shook her head slightly. But Richard was determined. The Charleston move was already financially stretching us, though I didn't realize how much at the time. He said we couldn't afford both a fresh start and your education. So he chose himself, I observed, the insight crystallizing years of confusion. As he always did. She didn't deny it. Yes. We sat in silence for a moment, the admission settling between us, neither healing nor wounding, but simply truth finally acknowledged. Where did you go? She asked quietly. After? Ms. Chen took me in, my debate coach and her sister. They helped me get additional financial aid for Emerson, supported me through college, became the family I needed. I met her gaze directly. They showed me what unconditional love actually looks like. Another tear slipped down her cheek. I'm glad, she whispered, that someone was there for you when we weren't. The genuine relief in her voice suggested she had indeed worried, despite her inaction. The realization didn't absolve her, but it complicated the narrative I'd constructed of parents who had simply ceased to care the moment I was no longer legally their responsibility. Why reach out now? I asked. After 9 years of silence? She dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. When your father came home yesterday, he was shaken. I've only seen him like that a few times in 40 years of marriage. He said you'd walked into that meeting room like you owned the world. A hint of wistful pride colored her voice. That you were poised and articulate and clearly respected by everyone there. And this surprised him? I couldn't keep the edge from my tone. No, not surprised. Shamed him, I think. Made him face what he'd thrown away. She met my gaze directly for perhaps the first time in our conversation. I've been wanting to find you for years, Olivia. I just didn't know how. Didn't know if you'd want to hear from me. When Richard said you were here, that you seemed willing to speak with him at least professionally, I had to try. I considered her words, weighing them against years of hurt and abandonment. There was truth in her explanation, I sensed, but also convenient timing. Would she have reached out if my father's company weren't in crisis? If I hadn't appeared in a position of relative power over him? I've built a good life, I said finally, without either of you. I have people who love me unconditionally, work that fulfills me, and a sense of self-worth that doesn't depend on external validation. As you should, she agreed softly. I'm not asking to reclaim a place in your life, Olivia. I don't deserve that. I just wanted you to know that not a day has passed that I haven't regretted my cowardice, that I'm proud of the woman you've become, even knowing I contributed nothing to that becoming. The words were perhaps the most honest my mother had ever spoken to me, an acknowledgement of failure without expectation of forgiveness. For the first time in our conversation, I felt something shift within me, not forgiveness exactly, but a loosening of the tight knot of anger I'd carried for so long. I need to go, I said, glancing at my watch. I have stakeholder interviews beginning at 9. She nodded, making no effort to prolong the meeting. Thank you for this time. It means more than you know. As I gathered my belongings, she reached across the table, not quite touching me, but extending her hand in tentative offering. Would it be possible? Might we speak again before you leave Durham? I considered the request, searching my feelings for the honest answer. I don't know, I replied truthfully. I need to think about what this means for both of us. She withdrew her hand, nodding in acceptance of the boundary. Of course, whatever you decide, I understand. Standing to leave, I found myself adding, I'm here until next Friday. If I decide I want to talk again, I'll contact you." The small concession brought a flicker of hope to her expression. "Thank you, Olivia, for hearing me out, if nothing else." Walking to Taylor Construction's offices, I processed the unexpected emotional complexity of the morning's conversation. I had anticipated vindication, perhaps even satisfaction in confronting one of the architects of my abandonment. Instead, I felt a curious mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the relationship that might have been under different circumstances, relief that the narrative I'd constructed wasn't entirely accurate. My mother hadn't stopped caring. She had simply been too weak to act on that care when it mattered most. The realization didn't excuse her actions, but it did humanize them. And in that humanization lay an unexpected path forward. Not to reconciliation, necessarily, but perhaps to a more nuanced understanding that might eventually lead to genuine closure. As I entered the building, straightening my shoulders and shifting into professional mode, I realized that while I had indeed become my father's boss through an unexpected twist of corporate fate, the true power I now possessed wasn't over him, but within myself. The power to choose my own path forward, to determine which relationships deserved investment and which were better left in the past. The frightened 18-year-old girl who had been discarded like an unwanted obligation had indeed disappeared. In her place stood a woman who recognized her own worth, who had built a life on her own terms, and who now faced her past not from a place of lingering damage, but from a position of authentic strength. Whatever I decided about my parents and their place in my future, the decision would be mine alone, guided not by their expectations or limitations, but by my own carefully considered understanding of what constituted a life well lived. The next week at Taylor Construction unfolded in a strange rhythm of professional interactions layered over personal history. I maintained meticulous boundaries during work hours, focusing solely on the transition plan while treating my father with the same detached courtesy I extended to any client. If others noticed the tension between us, they attributed it to the natural strain of acquisition rather than personal history. My father, for his part, seemed to be undergoing his own internal recalibration. The bombastic authority figure who had dominated my childhood had been replaced by a more subdued presence, still proud, still resistant to the changes reshaping his company, but increasingly deferential in our interactions. Whether this transformation stemmed from genuine regret or simply pragmatic recognition of my influence over the transition process remained unclear. On Wednesday afternoon, I was reviewing employee communication materials in the main conference room when Martin, the financial officer, knocked hesitantly on the doorframe. "Ms. Taylor, do you have a moment?" I gestured for him to enter, noting the manila folder clutched in his hand. "Of course. Is there an issue with the severance package? Documentation?" Martin glanced nervously over his shoulder before closing the door. "No, nothing like that. He hesitated, then placed the folder on the table. "I thought you should see this." Inside was a stack of letters, at least a dozen, all addressed to Olivia Taylor at various colleges and universities. Boston University, Emerson College, NYU, Columbia. Each envelope showed a return address from Taylor Construction. Each bore a return to sender stamp, and all appeared to date from the period immediately following my departure from Durham. "I found these in Richard's old filing cabinet while clearing out documents for the transition," Martin explained, his discomfort evident. "I'm not sure if I should be showing you, but it felt important." I stared at the envelopes, something constricting in my chest. With careful control, I selected the one addressed to Emerson, slid out a single sheet of company letterhead, and began to read. "Olivia, I've been informed by the registrar that you've enrolled for the fall semester. I don't know how you managed it without our signature on loan documents, but I suppose I shouldn't be surprised by your resourcefulness. Your mother is concerned about your living arrangements. If you're having difficulties, you could consider returning to Durham and attending community college while working. Taylor Construction could use an office assistant, and the experience would be practical, unlike whatever impractical communications degree you're pursuing. Let me know your decision. Dad. The letter was quintessentially Richard Taylor, grudging. Acknowledgement wrapped in criticism, offering help framed as demand, withholding emotional connection, even in supposed reconciliation. I opened another, dated several months later. Olivia, your Christmas card to your mother arrived. The return address shows you're still at Emerson. I assume this means you found some way to support yourself. There's an internship opening at Durham Media Associates this summer. The owner is a golf partner who would consider you on my recommendation. Such connections are valuable in building a career, regardless of what they're teaching you in Boston. Let me know if you'll be returning for the summer. Dad. One by one, I opened the remaining letters. None contained apologies or acknowledgments of wrongdoing. Most offered some form of conditional support contingent on my return to Durham or abandonment of my chosen path. All were addressed to institutions where I might have enrolled, attempts to locate me without admitting they'd lost the right to know my whereabouts. Did you know about these? I asked Martin, my voice carefully controlled. He shook his head. Not until yesterday. Richard never mentioned attempting to contact you. He hesitated. None of them were delivered, obviously. The schools returned them since you either weren't enrolled there or had privacy protections on your student information. I nodded, gathering the letters and returning them to the folder. Thank you for bringing these to my attention. There's one more thing, Martin added reluctantly. These were all I found in the office, but Richard mentioned once, after a few drinks at the company Christmas party last year, that he had a drawer full at home. Letters he'd written, but never sent. He shrugged apologetically. I thought you should know. After Martin left, I sat motionless, processing this unexpected revelation. The letters changed nothing about what had happened. They didn't erase the abandonment or justify the cruelty of their actions. If anything, they highlighted my father's stubborn refusal to acknowledge his wrongdoing, his persistent belief that he could dictate terms of reconciliation without offering genuine remorse. Yet their existence complicated the narrative I'd constructed. He had thought of me during those years of silence, had attempted, however inadequately, to reestablish contact, had perhaps even, in his emotionally stunted way, worried about my welfare. That evening in my hotel room, I found myself calling not Abigail, but Lily, whose legal mind might help me navigate the complex emotional terrain these discoveries had revealed. Letters? Lily repeated after I'd explained. And none of them contained an actual apology? Not one, I confirmed. Just conditional offers wrapped in criticism. Classic Dad. I could almost see Lily's thoughtful expression through the phone. Speaking as someone who's witnessed countless custody and family disputes, it sounds like classic ambivalence. He couldn't bring himself to admit wrongdoing, but he also couldn't fully commit to cutting you off. What's the point of writing letters if they're just more manipulation? People are complicated, Olivia. He may not even have recognized the manipulative nature of his outreach. She paused. Did you tell your mother about the letters? I hadn't considered that option. No, we haven't spoken since coffee last week. Might be worth asking her perspective. These letters suggest there's more to the story than either of your parents initially acknowledged. After hanging up, I found myself contemplating Lily's suggestion. The coffee meeting with my mother had left me with conflicted feelings, anger at her passivity, but also a reluctant recognition of her evident regret. Unlike my father, she had acknowledged her failure without qualification. Perhaps she could provide context for his contradictory behavior. Before I could second-guess myself, I texted the number she'd used to contact me. Found some unsent letters from Dad. Coffee tomorrow morning. Same place? Her response came almost immediately. I'll be there. Thank you. The following morning, my mother arrived at Carolyn's 15 minutes early, already seated at the same table we'd occupied previously. She looked nervous but better composed than during our first meeting, her hair neatly styled, her casual outfit suggesting she'd made an effort without trying to appear too formal. "Thank you for reaching out," she said as I sat across from her, setting 2 coffees on the table, her black with 1 sugar, my cappuccino. "I wasn't sure I'd hear from you again." I placed the folder of letters between us. "Martin found these at the office. Apparently there are more at home." She nodded, her expression unsurprised. "In his desk drawer. He wrote them for years, especially after he'd been drinking. I urged him to actually send them, but..." She shrugged helplessly. "Richard has always struggled with admitting mistakes." "These aren't admissions of mistakes," I pointed out, opening the folder. "They're attempts to regain control, to bring me back to Durham on his terms." She considered this, fingers tracing the edge of an envelope. "That's partly true, but there's something else you should understand about your father. For him, offering practical help is the only way he knows to show care." "Abandoning your child isn't practical help," I countered, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "No, it was unforgivable," she agreed quietly. "I'm not defending his actions, or mine. I'm trying to help you understand them." She selected one of the letters, scanning its contents. "When he offers you an office job or an internship through his connections, that's his version of saying he's worried about you, that he wants to make things right. Without ever acknowledging, he was wrong in the first place," I noted. Yes, her admission was simple. "That's Richard. He can show remorse through actions but rarely through words." I studied her, noting the lines of strain around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that suggested ongoing stress. "How long did he keep writing these?" "Until about 3 years ago," she replied. "When the business started struggling, he became consumed with trying to save it, but before that, regularly, Christmas, your birthday, whenever he saw something about Emerson in the news." The image of my father drafting these inadequate, unsent attempts at connection on significant dates complicated my emotional response. Not enough to erase the damage, but enough to hint at a more nuanced reality than I'd constructed. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked directly. "Is it because the company's failing and you're worried about the future?" The question was harsh, but she didn't flinch from it. "Partly," she acknowledged with surprising candor. "The company was Richard's identity. Losing it has broken something in him, made him face questions about his worth that he's always measured through success." She looked up, meeting my gaze directly. "But it's also because seeing you again, successful, confident, clearly thriving, has forced us both to confront what we threw away, what we can never reclaim." Her honesty disarmed my prepared defenses. Throughout my childhood, my mother had hidden behind platitudes and social niceties, avoiding direct confrontation or emotional authenticity. This straightforward acknowledgement of selfish motivation alongside genuine regret felt new, perhaps evidence of her own growth during our years apart. "I don't know what you want from me," I admitted, the simple truth at the heart of our renewed contact. "Nothing you don't choose to give," she replied. "I lost the right to expectations 9 years ago." She hesitated, then added, "But if you're asking what I hope for, perhaps a chance to know the woman you've become, not as the daughter we failed, but as the remarkable person you've made yourself into despite us." The request was modest, yet monumental, an acknowledgement that the parent-child relationship had been irrevocably altered, but not necessarily the possibility of some new form of connection built on different terms. "I need to think about that," I said finally. 9 years of silence doesn't get erased in a week of conversations. She nodded, accepting this boundary without protest. "Of course. Whatever you decide, Olivia, know that I'm proud of you. Not that my pride means anything, but there it is." As we parted outside the coffee shop, she hesitated, then said, Richard would like to speak with you about something other than the transition, if you're willing. I considered declining outright, but curiosity prevailed. When? Tonight? Perhaps? We could meet at the house or somewhere neutral if you'd prefer. Neutral, I decided immediately. There's a restaurant called Elaine's downtown, 7 o'clock. She nodded, relief evident in her expression. He'll be there. Thank you, Olivia. Throughout the day's meetings at Taylor Construction, I found myself distracted by the upcoming dinner. What could my father possibly want to discuss that warranted a formal meeting? The revealed letters suggested a complexity to his feelings that he'd never verbalized, but nothing in our recent interactions indicated a fundamental change in his character or approach. By 7 o'clock, I'd changed into a simple black dress that projected casual confidence. Neither the armor-like professional attire I'd worn to our business meetings, nor anything suggesting particular emotional investment in the encounter. Elaine's was upscale but not ostentatious, its ambient lighting and well-spaced tables offering privacy without intimacy. I arrived precisely on time to find both my parents already seated, my father looking uncomfortable in a sports coat that hung slightly loose on his diminished frame. My mother had changed into a floral dress I didn't recognize, her hair freshly styled. The effort they'd made for this meeting was evident, triggering an unexpected pang of something like compassion beneath my carefully maintained composure. "Olivia," my father greeted me, half rising as I approached. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, taking the seat across from them, noting how they presented a united front despite the strain evident in their postures. A waiter appeared immediately, and I ordered a glass of Cabernet, buying time to adjust to this surreal family dinner that wasn't quite a reconciliation, but something more complex. After our drink orders arrived, an awkward silence descended. My father cleared his throat twice before finally speaking. "I understand Martin showed you some letters." "Yes." He nodded, his discomfort palpable. "There are more at home, none of them. None of them say what should have been said." He stared at his water glass, avoiding eye contact. "I'm not good with words, Olivia. Never have been." "That's not why you abandoned me," I replied evenly. "Let's not confuse verbal limitations with moral ones." His jaw tightened reflexively, the familiar defensive anger flickering before being visibly suppressed. Progress of a sort. The Richard Taylor I'd grown up with would have either lashed out or withdrawn into stony silence at such direct confrontation. "You're right," he acknowledged, the admission clearly costing him. "It wasn't about communication. It was about control and fear." "Fear of what?" He looked up, meeting my gaze directly for perhaps the first time in our adult interactions. "Of failing. As a father. As a provider. The business was already struggling when we made the decision about Charleston. I convinced myself that cutting expenses was necessary for survival." His voice roughened. "But the truth is, I took the coward's way out. I told myself you were strong enough to manage on your own because it was convenient to believe that." The unvarnished admission hung. Between us, its honesty more powerful than any elaborately crafted apology might have been. For my father, a man who had built his identity on projecting strength and certainty, such vulnerability represented a seismic shift. "It was wrong," he continued when I didn't immediately respond. "Unforgivable, as your mother says. But I want you to know that not a day has passed that I haven't regretted it. That I haven't wondered where you were, if you were safe, if you were happy." "You could have found out," I noted, keeping my voice level despite the emotions his words triggered. "You knew where I was enrolled. You could have called the university, sent a letter through proper channels, reached out to the Chens. You chose not to." He nodded, accepting this truth without defense. Pride. Stubborn, stupid pride. And fear that you'd reject any outreach, as you would have had every right to do. My mother reached for his hand, offering silent support as he struggled with emotions he'd likely spent decades suppressing. The gesture highlighted their continued partnership despite the evident downturn in their circumstances. They had chosen each other, for better or worse, while discarding me when convenience dictated. "Why now?" I asked, echoing the question I'd posed to my mother earlier. "Because the company's failing? Because I suddenly appeared in a position of influence over your future?" "Partly," he admitted, the honesty surprising me again. "Seeing you walk into that conference room, confident, successful, clearly respected by everyone there." He shook his head slightly. It forced me to face what I threw away, what we both threw away. My mother nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We're not asking for forgiveness, Olivia, or for you to forget what happened. But before you leave Durham, we wanted you to know the truth. That we've regretted our decision every day since you left. That we're proud of who you've become, even knowing we contributed nothing to that becoming." The echo of her words from our coffee meeting suggested they'd discussed this conversation in advance, perhaps rehearsed what needed to be said. The realization should have diminished the impact of their admission, but somehow it didn't. The very fact that they had prepared, had coordinated their approach to this difficult conversation, indicated how significant it was to them both. "I appreciate your honesty," I said finally, "but I don't know what you expect to come from this. 9 years is a long time. I've built a life without you in it." "We expect nothing," my father replied, the words clearly difficult for him. "But we hoped, perhaps, if you were willing, that we might begin to know the woman you've become. Not as the daughter we failed, but as the remarkable person you've made yourself into despite us." The near verbatim repetition of my mother's earlier phrasing confirmed my suspicion about their prepared approach. Yet beneath the rehearsed quality lay genuine emotion, evident in the slight tremor of my father's hands, the uncharacteristic vulnerability in his expression. "I need to think about that," I said, unconsciously echoing my response to my mother. "This doesn't erase what happened." "No," my father agreed quietly. "Nothing can. But perhaps something new might be possible, if you're willing to consider it." The remainder of the dinner passed in lighter conversation, neutral topics like changes to Durham since my departure, developments in the communications industry, careful inquiries about my life in Boston that respected my evident boundaries. Throughout, I observed them with the professional detachment I'd cultivated through years of client interactions, noting the subtle dynamics of their relationship, the deference my mother still showed toward my father despite his diminished circumstances, the careful way he modulated his typically domineering tendencies in my presence. As we prepared to leave, my father reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "One more thing. These are yours, regardless of what you decide about. Future contact." Inside were stock certificates representing a 15% ownership in Taylor Construction, dated from the month after I'd left Durham. "I don't understand," I said, studying the documents with professional wariness. "These are dated 9 years ago." He nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "After you left. After we made you leave." I set these aside, told myself it was an insurance, policy of sorts, that someday, when you'd learned your lesson about independence, I'd offer them as a way back into the family business. The admission of such calculated manipulation might once have wounded me deeply. Now, with years of perspective, I recognized it as quintessentially Richard Taylor, unable to admit error directly, but attempting to create a backdoor to reconciliation that maintained his control and authority. "The company's nearly worthless now," he continued, his voice rough with what might have been shame. "But when Vertex completes the acquisition, these shares will convert to Vertex stock at a predetermined ratio. It's not a fortune, but it's something. Something that should have been yours all along." I considered the certificates, understanding their dual nature, both genuine attempt at reparation and convenient salve to conscience. The fact that he'd held them for 9 years without attempting to deliver them underscored the complexity of his feelings, unable to completely sever the parental connection despite his actions, yet equally unable to humble himself enough to make meaningful amends. "Thank you," I said finally, placing the certificates back in the envelope. "I'll have my financial advisor review the terms of conversion." He nodded, accepting this business-like response to what had clearly been intended as a more emotional gesture. As we stood outside the restaurant, an uncomfortable silence descended, none of us quite knowing how to conclude this strange reunion. "When do you return to Boston?" my mother finally asked. "Sunday morning. The transition announcement goes public tomorrow, and I'll need Saturday to finalize the implementation plan." She nodded, clearly wanting to suggest another meeting before my departure, but respecting the boundaries I'd established. "Thank you for hearing us out, Olivia. Whatever you decide, it means everything that you were willing to listen." As they turned to leave, my father hesitated, then spoke without turning back. "We're not the same people who made that terrible decision 9 years ago. I hope someday you might be willing to know who we've become, as we hope to know who you've become." The simple statement hung in the night air as they walked away, my mother leaning slightly against my father, his arm supporting her in a gesture of mutual reliance I didn't remember from childhood. Watching them retreat toward their car, I was struck by how diminished they appeared. No longer the towering figures who had dominated my youth, but simply aging people facing the consequences of their choices, both professional and personal. Back in my hotel room, I called Abigail, needing her grounding perspective after the emotional complexity of the evening. "Stock certificates?" she repeated after I'd recounted the dinner. "From 9 years ago?" "Apparently his version of a trust fund," I confirmed, unable to keep a hint of bitter humor from my voice. "Set aside for when I'd learned my lesson and was ready to rejoin the family business." "Classic Richard Taylor," Abigail sighed, unable to admit fault directly, but still trying to maintain some connection on his terms. She paused. "How do you feel about all this, Olivia? Their sudden desire for reconciliation?" I considered the question carefully. Conflicted. Their timing is suspect, reaching out only when they're facing financial ruin and I've appeared in a position of relative power. But I hesitated, trying to articulate the complexity of my reaction. There seems to be genuine regret there, not just for how things turned out for them, but for what they did to me. "People can change," Abigail acknowledged. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to recognize what actually matters." Another pause. "What are you thinking of doing?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to walk away, to maintain the clean break that served me well for 9 years. But another part wonders if there might be value in some form of controlled contact. Not for their sake, but for mine. For closure, if nothing else." "Those aren't mutually exclusive options," Abigail pointed out gently. "You could allow limited contact while maintaining strong boundaries. Test the waters without committing to full reconciliation." Her wisdom, as always, offered a middle path I hadn't fully considered. The possibility of establishing a new relationship with my parents defined by adult terms rather than childhood patterns. Neither full estrangement nor unconditional forgiveness. The following morning brought the official announcement of Vertex's acquisition of Taylor Construction. I spent the day in back-to-back meetings, managing media inquiries, facilitating employee communication sessions, and finalizing transition documentation. My father participated as required but remained subdued, his usual authoritative presence replaced by quiet cooperation. Late that afternoon, as I was gathering materials from the final press briefing, he approached hesitantly. "You handled that well," he offered, gesturing toward the departing reporters. They seemed to accept the narrative about strategic regional consolidation. "That's the job," I replied, maintaining professional distance despite the personal undercurrents. Craft a narrative that serves all stakeholders' interests while remaining grounded in truth. He nodded, hovering awkwardly as if uncertain how to proceed. Your mother and I were wondering, hoping, really, if you might have time for breakfast tomorrow before you leave. Nothing formal, just a chance to talk without the pressure of a business context or a restaurant setting. The invitation represented exactly the kind of limited contact Abigail had suggested, a defined interaction with clear time boundaries, neither rejecting the possibility of some future relationship, nor committing to ongoing involvement in their lives. Where were you thinking? I asked, neither accepting nor declining. The house, he suggested tentatively. But if that's uncomfortable, we could meet at that coffee shop you and your mother found. The thought of entering their current home, a downsized reality I hadn't witnessed, held little appeal. Carolyn's would be better. 9 o'clock? Relief softened his features. We'll be there. Thank you, Olivia. That evening, I completed my final transition documentation and packed my belongings for the return to Boston. The week in Durham had been professionally successful. The acquisition announcement had been well received. The transition plan was solid, and Vertex leadership had expressed particular appreciation for my handling of community messaging around the restructuring. Personally, the experience had been more complex than I could have anticipated. The confrontation I'd imagined for years, standing before my father as a successful professional while he recognized what he'd discarded, had indeed occurred, but the satisfaction I'd expected had been complicated by unexpected revelations. The unsent letters, the stock certificates, the evident regret both my parents expressed, none erased the fundamental betrayal, but all suggested a more nuanced reality than the clean narrative of abandonment and triumph I'd constructed. The morning brought clear skies and mild temperatures. Durham at its spring best as I drove to Carolyn's for the final meeting with my parents. They were already seated at what had become our regular table, my mother in a casual sundress, my father in khakis and a polo shirt, weekend attire that emphasized the personal rather than professional nature of our meeting. Thank you for coming, my mother greeted me warmly, while my father simply nodded, his expression carefully neutral, as if afraid of overstepping. We exchanged pleasantries over coffee, discussing the successful transition announcement and my impending return to Boston. As the conversation reached a natural lull, I decided to address directly what had been implicit in our recent interactions. I've been thinking about what you both said, about the possibility of some form of contact going forward. They exchanged glances, hope and apprehension evident in their expressions. I'm not ready for a conventional parent-child relationship, I continued carefully. Too much has happened. Too much time has passed, but I'm willing to consider something new. Limited contact, on my terms, to see if there's any basis for a relationship between the adults we all are now. My father nodded slowly, accepting these terms without protest, another departure from the authoritarian figure who had dominated my childhood. What would that look like, from your perspective? Email initially, I specified. Monthly updates, perhaps. If that goes well, maybe periodic phone calls. I'm not promising more than that, and I reserve the right to step back if it becomes uncomfortable for any reason. That seems very reasonable, my mother agreed quickly, reaching for my father's hand in a silent plea for his compliance. He nodded again. Whatever you're comfortable with, Olivia. We're grateful for any chance. On any terms? The simple acceptance, without negotiation, without attempt to assert control, represented perhaps the most significant shift in my father's approach to our relationship. Whether born of genuine change or simply pragmatic recognition of his diminished position, it offered a foundation for potential reconnection that respected rather than negated our painful history. I should warn you, I added, maintaining direct eye contact, that I have people in my life now who are family in every way that matters. Abigail and Lily Chen took me in when you cast me out. They supported me, believed in me, helped me build the life I have now. Whatever develops between us will never diminish their place in my life. Of course, my mother agreed immediately. We owe them a debt we can never repay. My father's jaw tightened briefly before he managed a nod. They did what we should have done, what I should have done. The admission, perhaps the most direct acknowledgement of failure he'd offered, hung between us like a bridge tentatively extended across a chasm. Not enough to fully span the gap of 9 years, but perhaps sufficient to allow cautious first steps towards some new form of connection. As we prepared to part, my mother reached across the table, stopping just short of touching my hand. I know we don't deserve another chance, that we forfeited our right to be in your life long ago. But thank you for considering it, Olivia. It means more than we can express. My father added gruffly, "You've built an impressive life, on your own terms, by your own effort. Whatever happens going forward, I want you to know that I recognize that achievement is entirely yours. Not because of us, but despite us." The key, acknowledgement, free from the criticism or conditional praise that had characterized our relationship throughout my childhood, represented a fundamental shift in how he perceived me. No longer the extension of himself that had failed to meet expectations, but an independent adult whose accomplishments he recognized as legitimate and entirely self-created. Outside Carolyn's, as we prepared to go our separate ways, an awkward moment arose, the question of appropriate physical contact hovering unresolved. My mother clearly wanted to embrace me but restrained herself, respecting the boundaries I'd established. My father extended his hand formally, offering the professional courtesy that had defined our interactions throughout the week. After a moment's consideration, I accepted his handshake, noting the slight tremor in his grip that betrayed deeper emotion than his composed expression suggested. To my mother, I offered a brief, contained hug, neither the warm embrace she clearly desired nor the complete rejection of physical contact. A middle ground, like everything about this tentative reconnection. "Safe travels back to Boston," my father said, as they turned toward their car. "We'll wait for your email when you're ready." Driving back to my hotel to check out, I reflected on the strange journey of the past week. I had arrived in Durham seeking professional success and perhaps a measure of personal vindication, the opportunity to demonstrate my achievements to the parents who had deemed me unworthy of support. I had accomplished that goal, standing before my father as his effective superior in the business realm, he valued above all else. Yet what I departed with was more complex than the simple satisfaction of proven worth. The week had offered unexpected insights into the flawed, limited humans who had raised me. Not excusing their failures, but contextualizing them within their own fears and weaknesses. It had revealed the ambivalence that had apparently characterized their 9 years of silence, unable to properly acknowledge their wrongdoing, yet unwilling to completely sever the connection. Most importantly, it had confirmed what I had built for myself in their absence. Not just professional success, but an authentic identity grounded in chosen relationships and personal values, rather than desperate attempts to earn conditional approval. The frightened 18-year-old girl they had abandoned had indeed disappeared, replaced by a woman who could face her past from a position of genuine strength rather than lingering damage. As my plane lifted off from Raleigh-Durham International, I opened my journal and wrote, 9 years ago, I was discarded by people who should have cherished me. Today, I choose whether they have a place in my life going forward, not from a position of need or lingering hurt, but from one of authentic power and clear-eyed compassion. Whatever relationship may develop from here will be on my terms, honoring the truth of our past while allowing for the possibility of something new. Not because they deserve it, but because I deserve closure on my own terms. Closing the journal, I gazed out the window as North Carolina receded beneath clouds. The journey ahead remained uncertain. Whether the tentative reconnection with my parents would develop into something sustainable, or prove another disappointment remained to be seen. But whatever the outcome, I faced it not as the abandoned daughter seeking validation, but as a complete person evaluating whether these flawed humans might earn a place in my life based on who they were becoming rather than who they had been. The true victory, I realized, wasn't becoming my father's boss in a literal corporate sense. It was becoming the author of my own story, capable of writing its next chapters from a position of authentic strength, emotional clarity, and hard-won wisdom about what constituted a life well lived. In that realization lay the most profound vindication of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. That my future was my responsibility alone. I maintained eye contact, my voice level. You were right, as it happens. My future was my responsibility, and I built one. Without your name, your money, or your approval. A flush crept up his neck. We did what we thought was best. You were always so different, independent. We thought you'd thrive with a push toward self-sufficiency. The justification was so absurd, so transparently self-serving that I nearly laughed. Is that the story you've been telling yourself? That abandoning your 18-year-old daughter without resources or support was an act of tough love? We left you the car, he countered weakly. This time I did laugh. The sound brief and disbelieving. The 15-year-old Honda that needed transmission work? How generous. His expression hardened into the familiar mask of disapproval I'd grown up fearing. You've done well enough without our help, clearly. This attitude only confirms we made the right decision. No, I said quietly, the simple denial carrying the weight of 9 years of perspective. You made the most convenient decision for yourselves. But you're right about one thing. I did do well. Just not because you abandoned me. I did well because I found people who actually cared about my well-being, who supported my goals instead of treating me like an inconvenient obligation. He flinched slightly, and for a moment I glimpsed something vulnerable beneath his defensive anger. Perhaps genuine regret, or more likely, simple discomfort at being confronted with the consequences of his actions. Is that why you took this assignment? He asked. To throw your success in my face? I considered the question honestly. No, I took it because it's my job, and I'm very good at it. Your company is simply another client acquisition requiring strategic communication, management. I gathered my materials, preparing to recall the Vertex team. The fact that it allows you to see who I became without you is merely an unexpected benefit. Before he could respond, I opened the door, gesturing for Catherine and her colleague to return. I believe we've addressed the company's specific concerns, I said smoothly. Let's continue with implementation planning. The remainder of the meeting proceeded with strained professionalism. Richard contributed minimally, his attention clearly divided between the business discussion and his own internal processing. When Catherine announced that I would be on site for the next 2 weeks overseeing the transition communications, his jaw tightened, but he offered no objection. As the meeting concluded, Catherine pulled me aside. Is everything all right? There seems to be some tension between you and Mr. Taylor. I maintained my professional demeanor. Nothing that will impact the project. Mr. Taylor and I have some history. I grew up in Durham before relocating to Boston. She nodded, accepting this partial explanation. Well, we're grateful to have someone with your expertise handling this. Transition. It's a sensitive situation for all involved. That's precisely why I'm here, I assured her. Navigating sensitive transitions is my specialty. As Catherine and her colleague departed, I lingered in the conference room, organizing my notes and preparing for an afternoon of stakeholder interviews. My father hovered near the doorway, clearly wrestling with whether to continue our conversation. Will you be seeing your mother while you're in town? He finally asked. The question surprised me. I wasn't planning to. Is she still in Durham? He nodded, his expression unreadable. We live in Woodcrest now. Smaller house, but nice neighborhood. Woodcrest was a modest development for early retirees, a far cry from the prestigious address they'd maintained during my childhood. The downgrade confirmed what the financial documents had suggested. Taylor Construction's troubles had significantly impacted their personal finances. "I'm staying at the Marriott downtown," I replied, neither accepting nor rejecting the implicit invitation in his question. "My schedule will be quite full with transition interviews." He nodded again, lingering awkwardly. In the silence, I studied him more carefully than I'd allowed myself during the meeting. The imposing figure who had dominated my childhood had diminished somehow, not just physically, though he had indeed grown thinner and slightly stooped, but in presence. The man who had once seemed to occupy outsized space now appeared ordinary, even small. "You look like your grandmother," he said suddenly. "My mother. She had that same directness." The observation startled me. My paternal grandmother had died when I was very young. I had only the vaguest memories of a stern woman who smelled of peppermint and kept hard candies in her purse. My father had rarely spoken of her. "I wouldn't know," I replied. "We didn't exactly maintain family connections." He flinched slightly at the pointed reminder. "No, I suppose not." Another uncomfortable pause. "Your mother would like to see you, I think, if you have time." I closed my portfolio deliberately, buying a moment to process my response. 9 years ago, I would have given anything for such an overture. Now, I felt surprisingly ambivalent. What could possibly be gained from such a reunion? What closure remained unachieved after the morning's revelations? "I'll consider it," I said finally, neither committing nor refusing. Right now, my priority is ensuring this transition proceeds smoothly for all stakeholders. "Of course," he nodded, retreating to more comfortable professional territory. "You're very competent. Hammond is fortunate to have you." The grudging acknowledgement of my professional capabilities might once have meant everything. The paternal approval I desperately sought throughout my childhood. Now, it felt hollow, too little and far too late. "Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I'll be conducting employee interviews this afternoon."